be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Raising his eyes toward his disciples, Jesus said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for the kingdom of God is yours. Blessed are you who are now hungry, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who are now weeping, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude and insult you and denounce your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice and leap for joy on that day. Behold, your reward will be great in heaven. For their ancestors treated the prophets the same way. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. But woe to you who are filled now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will grieve and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for their ancestors treated as false prophets in this way." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
And so for preparing for today's Mass that brings us together, caminantes, we remember from the Camino Ignaciano, the Camino de Santiago this summer, I thought perhaps it would be most appropriate to have done the Mass for Santiago Apóstol. This is what brings us together tonight. But at the same time, today's a feast, and it's the feast of the Holy Name of Mary. And so, the Agrupación is a Marian congregation. I guess she takes priority. And Santiago takes the second seat again. Because if anyone remembers the readings that go along with the Feast of Santiago, it's always the same one. It's the mother of the two brothers of Zebedee, the sons of Zebedee, that asked Jesus, "Put my sons on your left and your right." And Jesus says, "That's not for me to give, that's to someone else." And if anyone knows your Christian art pretty well, there's only one person who sits at the right hand of Christ. It's Mary. So Santiago takes the second seat again tonight. Yes, because today is also Mary's feast. And also, it would have liberated me from having to preach about the first reading. Because if you heard that reading well, every priest reads that one. What's going on? Paul says, for those who are married, act like you're not married. Okay? For those who are not married, don't get married. And if you happen to do get married, well, stick it through. You're not going to enjoy it, but, continue. I mean, it is always a mystery when they get this one, and then you get the Beatitudes, or like, okay, let's think about that instead. But actually, Ignatian spirituality saves us tonight. Because looking at that first reading from Corinthians, that Paul writes about this state marriage and whether you be married or not, or look for to be married or not be married, etc., actually ties in very closely with the rules for discernment that St. Ignatius presents to us in the spiritual exercises. And there's some who probably have this fresh in their minds, and it echoes right into it. And so, one thing that helps me being studying history over these past years has been to help put things in context. And this reading for sure needs to be put in context, otherwise it just doesn't make sense. We have to put ourselves in the context of the early Christian community. In the first century, it's actually the first decades after Christ came and resurrected and ascended into heaven. And in those first decades, those first Christians, those early Christian communities, were convinced that the second coming of Christ, the end of the world, the end of days and the final judgment, were going to come actually very soon. In fact, they believed that they were going to see it. It was going to be in their lifetime. And so when we look at Paul's preaching, especially when he preaches to these early Christian communities, there's a certain immediacy that's associated to it. You have to convert now. Don't wait till tomorrow, right now, right away. Because the Lord's day is coming. It's almost here. And there's no time really to take your time and convert slowly into the small process and kind of what we're used to now. No, it had to be done right away. And what St. Paul is talking about right here is what St. Ignatius would have called states of your state in life, or your vocation in life. And one of the spiritual exercises and one of those, the meditations on those rules of discernment was, especially when you discern in what state of life you're going to serve the Lord. To what degree are you going to serve the Lord? And that's usually associated with vocation. We're called by the Lord to serve Him in different ways and to different degrees. And so when discerning that degree or that election, that's the word he uses, to choose how we're going to serve God, he also says, well, there's some ways that we can choose God that cannot be changed. Those are what we call unchangeable or immutable elections. Those that can be changed, mutable elections. And there's certain times when conviene, when it's actually good to make a revision or change or to review one's decision, and certain times when you should not absolutely do this. You should actually let it go and stay the course. Desolation and consolation. I think we've heard of that many times. And so when one is consoled and one feels the presence of God, and one is with God and senses Him everywhere and sees Him, well, there's the moment that our elections are oftentimes confirmed. And the times that we can make new elections, always serving the Lord, always looking to see how we can fulfill that principle and foundation, that's to serve and revere the Lord with everything we have. There are certain times when we should not make any revisions or changes or new elections. In a moment of desolation, a moment when I cannot perceive God, when I don't see Him around me, or He's not in my life at the moment. That's not the time to take dramatic changes and very important life-changing decisions in the time of desolation. And that's exactly what St. Paul is telling us right here in that first reading. Different states of life. Think about it. Having a wife, not having a wife. Do not be attached to the things that you have now. Giving up those things. In that immediacy of waiting for Christ to come that second time, in the immediacy of waiting for that last judgment, St. Paul is telling us, don't change your election. Don't come into new elections. Those of you who are married, good, persist, but realize that the days are coming. And remember, back in that time, the Bible is not politically correct. Wives, and that's the only word he uses, they were considered property. And so in a certain way, don't feel so attached. Be open, because the end days are here to come. But at the same time, is those who haven't made that election, those who haven't changed their state in life, don't change it now. This is not the moment to change it, right before Christ comes. Stay with where you are. And if you do happen to change that state in life, we'll see it through. And so I think that's where he's aiming at us, aiming to take us in this first reading. It's basically discernment. Ignatian discernment, pre-Ignatian discernment, if you will. Which also leads into that gospel, the Beatitudes, which we've heard so many times. But even the Beatitudes tell us how things can change a lot of times, how exaltation and praise can become despair and anguish, yet in moments of anguish and desolation can become moments of consolation and triumph even. And so, knowing that those states change, we shouldn't be all taken completely by one or by the other, whereas one is in consolation and feels God's presence, knowing that, well, the mal espíritu, the evil spirit, is looking to a way to bring me away from that consolation, to bring me down from it, and to be aware of that, even though I feel God's presence around me. And those who are in desolation know that that can change too. And that's what St. Ignatius tells us even later on in those rules for discernment. When one's in that moment of desolation and doesn't feel God, you stay the course, it's like a passing storm. And so we don't take drastic decisions that changes things. We wait out because it will change. We've been through this before. We know it has an end. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel, even though it may be far away. And so, hopefully that helps us make a little bit more sense of these readings, especially in the context of today's feast. And with the name of Mary, like I mentioned before, is another prayer. I always say Jesus' name is the shortest prayer of all. If we don't know what to say, just the name of Jesus itself is a prayer. Mary's name as well, as she has brought our Savior into the world. Her name is also sacred. Her name was also pronounced by the Lord, speaking to when he gave that Hail Mary, that Salve. And so we turn ourselves to Mary today as well, to help us in those moments of desolation, to stay through, to keep us confirmed in our elections in life, in our state of life, the state that we've chosen to serve the Lord, in which we've been called to serve the Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.